Welcome back, folks. Great to have you. Rush Limbaugh here on Thanksgiving Eve. And it's time now for our annual tradition. The true and real story of Thanksgiving, as written by me in my second bestseller of 2.5 million copies in hardback, was entitled See, I Told You So. And the real story of Thanksgiving is found in Chapter 6, Dead White Guys, or What the History Books Never Told You, the true story of Thanksgiving. By the way, this true story is also recreated in my latest bestseller, Rush, Revere, and the Brave Pilgrims. The story of the Pilgrims begins in the early part of the 17th century. The Church of England under King James I was persecuting anyone and everyone who did not recognize its absolute civil and spiritual authority. Those who challenged ecclesiastical authority and those who believed strongly in freedom of worship were actually hunted down, imprisoned, sometimes executed for what they believed. A group of separatists first fled to Holland and established a community. After 11 years, about 40 of them agreed to make a perilous journey to the New World, where they would certainly face hardships, but could live and worship God according to the dictates of their own consciences. On August 1st, 1620, the Mayflower set sail. It carried a total of 102 passengers and a talking horse, including 40 pilgrims. Well, I'm just making up the talking horse bit. It carried a total of 102 passengers, including 40 pilgrims led by William Bradford. On the journey, Bradford set up an agreement, a contract, that established just and equal laws for all members of this new community, irrespective of their religious beliefs. Now, where did the revolutionary ideas expressed in the Mayflower Compact come from? Well, they came from the Bible. The Pilgrims were a people completely steeped in the lessons of the Old and New Testaments. They looked to the ancient Israelites for their example. And because of the biblical precedents set forth in Scripture, they never doubted that their experiment would work. But this voyage on the Mayflower was no pleasure cruise. The journey to the New World was long and arduous. And when the Pilgrims landed in New England in November, they found, according to William Bradford's detailed journal, a cold and barren, desolate wilderness. There were no friends to greet them, he wrote. There were no houses to shelter them. There were no inns where they could refresh themselves. The sacrifice they made for freedom was just beginning. They stayed and lived on the Mayflower, some of them, for quite a while. During the first winter, half of the Pilgrims, including William Bradford's own wife, died of either starvation, sickness, or exposure. When spring finally came, it's true, Indians taught the settlers how to plant corn, how to fish for cod, and skin beavers for coats. Life improved for the Pilgrims, but they didn't prosper yet. Now, this is important to understand because this is where modern history lessons in the teaching of Thanksgiving often ends. Pilgrims, poor, desolate, starving, homeless, new place, not knowing anything. Indians came along and saved them. And that is where most kids' story of Thanksgiving stops. But it really hadn't even yet begun. Thanksgiving is actually explained in some textbooks as a holiday for which the Pilgrims gave thanks to the Indians for saving their lives, rather than as a devout expression of gratitude grounded in the Bible. Now, here's the part that's been omitted. The original contract that the Pilgrims had entered into with their merchant sponsors in London called for everything they produced to go into a common store, and each member of the community, every pilgrim was entitled to one common share. All of the land that they cleared and all the houses they built belonged to everybody, the community. They were going to distribute everything they produced and everything they built equally. All the land they cleared and the houses they built belonged to the community as well. Nobody owned anything. They just had an equal share in all of it. It was a commune, folks. It was the forerunner to the communes that we saw in the 60s and 70s out in California. And it was complete with organic vegetables, by the way. I mean, there was no question the vegetables were organic. They didn't have fertilizer back then yet. Monsanto didn't exist. There was no Archer Daniels Midland corrupting and polluting our food. There was no Van Camps or Stokely's or Heinz or any of that. There was no John Kerry. There was no Teresa Forbes Kerry or whatever, Heinz Kerry. It was just the Pilgrims and the land. William Bradford, who had become the new governor of the colony, recognized that this form of collectivism was costly and destructive to the Pilgrims as that first harsh winter which had taken so many lives. So he decided to take bold action. William Bradford assigned a plot of land to each family to work and manage, and it was theirs. I mean, he assigned it, but they owned it. And he turned loose the power of the free marketplace in the process. Long before Karl Marx was even born, the Pilgrims had discovered and learned and experimented what could only be described as socialism, and it didn't work. They nearly starved. It's never worked. You know why it didn't work? What Bradford and his community found was that the most creative and industrious people had no incentive to work any harder than anybody else because everybody had an equal share. Unless they could utilize the power of personal motivation, they were not going to be able to change anything. While most of the rest of the world has been experimenting with socialism for well over 100 years, trying to refine it, perfect it, reinvent it, spend more money on it, the Pilgrims learned early on that it was a failure, and they scrapped it permanently. What Bradford wrote about this experiment should be in every school child's history lesson, because if it were, we might prevent a whole lot of needless suffering in the future, such as what we're enduring now, trying the same thing over and over. This is Bradford. The experience that we had in this common course and condition, experience we had tried sundry years, that by taking away property and bringing community into a commonwealth would make them happy and flourishing, as if they were wiser than God, he wrote. For this community, so far as it was found to breed much confusion and discontent, and retard much employment that would have been to their benefit and comfort, meaning nobody worked any harder than they had to because they didn't get to keep anything that they made. It all went into a common store. There was a bunch of laziness that set in, and some people didn't do anything. They got an equal share of everything anyway, so why work? It's human nature. Bradford wrote, "For young men that were most able and fit for labor and service did repine that they should spend their time and strength to work for other men's wives and children without being paid for it." Meaning they finally figured out, why are we doing this? The ones who were working, the ones who were creative, industrious, while others are sitting around doing it, why should we do this? It was thought injustice, Bradford wrote. Why should you work for other people when you can't work for yourself? That's what he was saying. The Pilgrims found that people could not be expected to do their best work without incentive. So what did Bradford's community try next? Well, what they did was unharness the power of good old free enterprise by invoking the undergirding capitalistic principle of private property. Bradford again. Every family was assigned its own plot of land to work and permitted to market its own crops and products. And what was the result? This had very good success, wrote Bradford, for it made all hands industrious, so as more corn was planted than otherwise would have been. It's trickle down here, folks. The Pilgrims discovered it, supply-side economics. It existed long before the 1980s. Now, this is where it gets good. If you're laboring under the misconception that I was, as I was taught in school, they set up trading posts. They exchanged goods with the Indians. The Indians had saved their lives earlier, but now they had all of this bounty that their foray into capitalism had produced. Their profit allowed them to pay off the debts they had to the merchant sponsors in London who had funded the voyage in the first place. The success and the prosperity of the Plymouth settlement attracted even more Europeans. It became known as the Great Puritan Migration. The word of prosperity spread back across the Atlantic Ocean. That's how big it was. But this story stops when the Indians taught the newly arrived suffering in socialism Pilgrims how to plant corn and fish for cod. That's where the original Thanksgiving story stops. The story basically doesn't even begin there. The real story of Thanksgiving is William Bradford giving thanks to God for the guidance and the inspiration to set up a thriving colony. The bounty was shared with the Indians. There was a thanks to the Indians. They had so much, they had the Indians over. They did sit down. They had free-range turkey. They had organic vegetables. But it wasn't the Indians who saved the Pilgrims. It wasn't the Indians who saved the day. I mean, they were not bad people, don't misunderstand. But the modern story of Thanksgiving is that without the Indians, the Pilgrims would never have mattered. That's not what they were giving thanks for. It was capitalism and Scripture which saved the day, as acknowledged by George Washington in his first Thanksgiving proclamation, 1789. Folks, if you read, and I've got it here, I don't think I'm going to have time to get into it, but George Washington's original Thanksgiving proclamation will send any atheist running to the hills. It is thanks to God for the Constitution, for the inspiration for the Constitution. Thanks to God for the inspiration, the founding of the country. It's just, this is why so many of us are so devoted to preserving this country as founded and not allowing it to become what the Pilgrims nearly died first establishing. And I can't leave it here without once again telling all of you how utterly important you are to this country and how utterly important you are to this program. How much you have meant to me and my family and all of us here, the overrated staff, everybody. This show would not exist, and it would not be what it is today without you. And we love you to death here because we know that you are the people who make this country work. I wish there were ways beyond words that I could show you and express it. But as of now, there aren't. So I'll just have to use my words. But believe me, we all here have the greatest appreciation for all of you and how much and how utterly important you all are to this country. That's the true story of Thanksgiving. Have a great one.